Eleanor's hands trembled against the binoculars. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched Mason Reynolds standing between Victor Blackwood's hunting party and the wounded mother bear. His arms were outstretched like a human shield, blood soaking through his flannel shirt where the bullet had grazed him, yet he refused to move. "Get out of the way, Reynolds!" Victor's voice carried across the clearing, rifle still aimed. Behind Mason, the injured bear curled protectively around her cub, the same cub Eleanor had watched Mason cradle in his arms just weeks ago, fighting desperately to save its life. The mother's dark eyes, unnervingly human in their awareness, shifted between the armed men and Mason's back, as though calculating whether this human, this stranger who had saved her baby, would now die protecting them both. And Eleanor knew in that moment that what had begun as a simple act of mercy had somehow unleashed forces that would either heal or destroy them all. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Mason Reynolds stood on his cabin porch at dawn, steam rising from his coffee mug as he surveyed the misty Blue Ridge Mountains. 7 years in this remote corner of Virginia, and the view still caught in his throat some mornings. The isolation had been his choice after Sarah died, after the crash that took her and their unborn daughter Emily. Some days he could almost convince himself he'd found peace. His cabin sat at the edge of a clearing, backing up to thousands of acres of forest. Simple. Functional. Books lined every wall, half research journals from his previous life as a wildlife biologist, half filled with his own handwriting. The memoir of his work with bears remained unfinished, abandoned like everything else when Sarah's car slid off that rain-slicked mountain road. Mason's nearest neighbor, Eleanor Winters, lived a mile down the gravel road. At 65, the retired wildlife researcher had become the closest thing to a friend he had these days. She'd worked with bears for over 30 years before the arthritis in her hands forced retirement. Sometimes, when the silence grew too heavy, he'd visit her little blue house filled with photographs of the animals she'd studied. The town of River Point lay 15 miles away, small enough that Mason could slip in and out for supplies without much human contact. The locals had stopped trying to draw him into conversation years ago, accepting his nods and brief answers for what they were. The boundaries of a man who'd lost too much. Margaret Wilson ran the general store, her 70 years sitting lightly on shoulders that had carried their share of burdens. She watched Mason with knowing eyes whenever he came in, as if waiting for something to change. "You're not the only one who's known grief, young man," she'd told him once. The only time she'd directly addressed his isolation. Sheriff Thomas Harrison kept things running smoothly in River Point, a fair man with a pragmatic approach to law enforcement. He'd check on Mason occasionally, ostensibly to warn about increased bear activity or hunting regulations, but Mason recognized the welfare checks for what they were. The only cloud on Mason's horizon was Victor Blackwood's growing presence in the region. The resort developer had purchased large tracts of land nearby, with plans for a luxury wilderness retreat. Mason had heard rumors of Blackwood's personal vendetta against the local wildlife, particularly the bears, though he'd avoided learning the details. Mason sipped his cooling coffee, watching a cardinal flit between branches. Writing had given him purpose after the university asked him to take leave, their gentle way of addressing his inability to function after the funeral. His articles on wildlife conservation still appeared in journals under a pseudonym. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the one he had managed to build from the ashes of what came before. He couldn't have known that morning, as he stood contemplating another solitary day, that fate was about to crash into his carefully constructed isolation in the form of a desperate mother and her dying child. The morning had barely begun when Mason heard it, a low, plaintive sound from the direction of his porch. Not quite a growl, not quite a whimper. Something in between that raised the hair on the back of his neck. He set his coffee down slowly, moving toward the window with caution. 7 years in these mountains had taught him respect for the wild things that shared this land. Through the glass, he saw her, a massive black bear standing on his porch. For a moment, his heart hammered against his ribs as primitive fear took hold. But something was wrong. The bear wasn't displaying typical behavior. She stood unnaturally still, her massive body trembling slightly. What struck Mason most were her eyes. Dark, wet, almost human-like, fixed on his door with an intensity that seemed impossible for a wild animal. "What the hell?" he whispered, reaching for the shotgun he kept by the door more out of habit than intention. That's when he noticed what she carried. Dangling from her mouth was a small, limp form, a cub, its fur matted with blood, one leg hanging at an unnatural angle. The mother bear placed the cub gently on his porch, then backed away several feet, sitting back on her haunches. She didn't leave. She just stared at the door, then at her cub, then back at the door. Mason's hand fell away from the shotgun. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. Against every survival instinct, against every wildlife management protocol he'd learned in his previous career, Mason opened the door. The mother bear flinched but didn't move, didn't charge. Her eyes, those impossibly aware eyes, remained fixed on him. The cub lay motionless on the wooden planks. It was small, probably born earlier that spring, its chest barely moving with shallow breaths. Blood crusted around one ear and matted the fur on its side. Mason's professional assessment was automatic. Severe trauma, possibly internal bleeding, shock. His personal reaction came a heartbeat later. This was a dying child in front of its mother. "I'll try," he said, the words coming unbidden, spoken to the bear as if she could understand. "I'll try to help." Moving with deliberate slowness, Mason knelt and gathered the cub in his arms. It weighed less than he expected, its body cool against his chest. The mother bear made a soft sound, not a growl, something else, but remained seated, watching. Mason backed into his cabin, heart pounding, expecting at any moment to feel claws tearing into him. But the attack never came. Through the window he saw the mother bear still sitting there, a sentinel unwilling to leave. Inside, Mason laid the cub on his kitchen table, mind racing. The wounds looked like punctures, another animal's attack, not a fall or human-caused injury. He grabbed towels, a heating pad, the first aid kit he'd kept stocked from his research days. His fingers moved automatically, checking vital signs, clearing airways, assessing damage. It had been years since he'd treated an injured animal, but the training remained. The cub's heartbeat was weak but present, its breathing shallow but steady. Mason reached for his phone and dialed Eleanor. "Mason, it's barely 7 in the morning," she answered, voice thick with sleep. "I need you. Emergency. Bear cub, badly injured. Mother brought it to my door." A pause. The mother brought... Wait, the mother bear is still there? Sitting on my porch, watching. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Keep it warm. Check for bleeding. Don't give it water yet." Mason set to work, gently cleaning wounds with antiseptic, wrapping the cub in warm towels, placing the heating pad beneath the bundle. As he worked, memories surfaced. Sarah in their university lab, treating a fox kit with a broken leg, her gentle hands and focused expression. "Every life matters, Mason," she'd said. "Even the small ones, especially the small ones." The thought of Sarah sent a familiar pain through his chest. She would have known exactly what to do now. She'd specialized in bear rehabilitation before. A sound from outside interrupted his thoughts. The mother bear had moved closer to the window, watching his every move with that unsettling intensity. Mason spoke to the cub as he worked, the way Sarah always had with injured animals. "Hang in there, little one. Help is coming." By the time Eleanor's truck rumbled up the drive, Mason had stabilized the cub as best he could. The bleeding had slowed, though one puncture wound on its flank worried him, deep and possibly infected. Eleanor burst through the door, medical bag in hand, freezing momentarily at the sight of the mother bear still watching from the porch. "Good Lord," she whispered, then turned her attention to the kitchen table. Her experienced hands took over, examining the cub with practiced efficiency. "Male, about 4 months old," she muttered. "These are bite wounds. Adult male, I'd guess. They'll sometimes kill cubs to bring the female back into estrus." Mason nodded. He'd studied the behavior during his research years. "What I can't understand," Eleanor continued, administering an antibiotic injection with steady hands, "is why she brought him to you. I've never seen or heard of such behavior." Mason glanced at the window. "Look at her eyes, Eleanor. Have you ever seen a bear look like that?" Eleanor paused in her work to study the mother bear. "No," she admitted after a moment. "There's something different. Wait." She squinted. "Is that a tracking collar?" Mason grabbed his binoculars from a shelf and focused on the bear's neck. Partially hidden by fur was a weathered radio collar. "You're right, F2211. Do you recognize the number?" Eleanor shook her head. "Not offhand, but it means she's been handled by researchers before." "That might explain her unusual behavior, previous human contact." As they worked to stabilize the cub, Mason noticed something else. "Look at her right ear. There's a crescent-shaped scar." Eleanor peered through the binoculars. "You're right. That's distinctive. I can check the database when I get home, see if there's a record." For hours, they worked over the cub, cleaning wounds, administering fluids, monitoring vital signs. The mother bear never left, though she occasionally paced or lay down, always keeping the cabin in sight. By mid-afternoon, the cub showed the first encouraging signs. A small paw twitched, its breathing deepened. When Mason dribbled sugar water into its mouth, its tiny tongue moved to lick. "He's fighting," Eleanor said, relief evident in her voice. "These next 24 hours will be critical, but he's got a chance." Mason nodded, surprised by the surge of hope he felt. It had been so long since he'd allowed himself to care this deeply about anything's survival. Eleanor gathered her things as evening approached. "I'll come back tomorrow with more supplies. Keep him warm. Continue the sugar water every hour. Call me if anything changes." At the door she paused. "Mason, what are you going to do about her?" She nodded toward the mother bear, now lying at the edge of the porch, head on paws but eyes still alert. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've never seen anything like this. She should have left or attacked or something, but she's just waiting." "It's like she knows you're trying to help," Eleanor said softly. "Like she's trusting you." After Eleanor left, Mason made a bed for the cub near the wood stove. Night was falling, and with it came a gentle rain that pattered against the roof. He expected the mother bear to seek shelter, but when he checked, she remained, now under the porch overhang, still watching. Mason settled into his armchair near the cub, prepared for a long night of hourly monitoring. In the flickering light from the wood stove, the cub's small chest rose and fell with greater strength than before. "Your mama's something else," he told the sleeping cub. "Never seen anything like her." As darkness wrapped around the cabin, Mason found himself drawn repeatedly to the window, checking on the bear's shadowy form. Something about her vigilance touched him deeply, reminding him of nights he'd spent by Sarah's hospital bed after the accident, holding her hand, willing her to fight, to stay. In the quietest hour of night, the cub stirred and made a soft whimpering sound. Mason knelt beside it, checking temperature, offering more sugar water. As he worked, he felt eyes on him and looked up to find the mother bear pressed against the window glass, watching intently. Their eyes met through the glass, human and animal, and in that moment Mason felt something impossible to articulate, a connection, an understanding, something that transcended the natural order of things. "I'm doing my best," he said softly to the watching eyes. "I promise." The bear blinked slowly as if in acknowledgement, then settled back down, her gaze never leaving the window. Mason returned to his chair, the cub now resting more peacefully beside him. For the first time in 7 years, the weight of solitude felt different. He wasn't alone in his vigil tonight. Outside in the rain sat another soul who understood what it meant to watch helplessly as a loved one fought for life. As dawn approached, Mason drifted into exhausted sleep, his hand resting protectively near the cub. He dreamed of Sarah, of the daughter they never had, of a family that existed only in the realm of what might have been. But for once, the dream didn't end in screeching tires and breaking glass. Instead, Sarah smiled at him and whispered, "Every life matters, Mason. Even yours." He woke to sunlight streaming through the windows and the cub making small movements beside him. Outside, the mother bear remained at her post, patient and unwavering in her vigil. 3 days passed in a strange rhythm of caring for the cub and watching the mother bear maintain her vigil. The cub, whom Mason had started thinking of as Hope, though he knew better than to name a wild animal, was slowly improving. The infection in his flank responded to the antibiotics Eleanor brought, and his appetite had grown from droplets of sugar water to a gruel of mashed berries and protein. Eleanor arrived each morning, medical bag in hand, her face a mix of professional concern and wonder at the unusual situation. On the 4th morning, she brought news. "I found her in the database," she announced, setting a folder on Mason's kitchen counter. F2211. She was tagged 8 years ago as part of the Blue Ridge Bear study. Mason glanced out the window where the mother bear dozed in the morning sun, her massive form deceptively peaceful. "What does the file say?" Eleanor opened the folder. "She was found as a cub herself, orphaned after her mother was killed by poachers. She was rehabilitated at the Blue Ridge Wildlife Center and released when she was about 18 months old." Eleanor paused, studying a photograph. "There's the crescent scar on her ear. She got it during rehabilitation, caught it on a fence." Mason took the photograph, studying the younger bear. "She has history with humans, then. That might explain her unusual behavior." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Perhaps. But Mason, I've worked with rehabilitated bears for 30 years. Even ones raised by humans typically revert to wild behavior after release. This level of trust, bringing her injured cub to a human, it's unprecedented." A thought struck Mason. "When was she rehabilitated? Which center?" Eleanor flipped through the pages. 2016-2017, Blue Ridge Center." Mason felt a chill run through him. "Sarah volunteered there during her doctoral work. 2016 would have been her 2nd year." Eleanor's eyes widened. "You think Sarah might have worked with this bear?" "It's possible." Mason stared at the photograph, memories surfacing. Sarah had talked about a special case, a female cub they'd named Shadow because she followed the caretakers like a shadow. She had a distinctive mark on her ear, Sarah had told him, a little crescent moon. Before Mason could pursue the thought, his phone rang. The screen showed Sheriff Harrison's name. "Morning, Sheriff," Mason answered. "Mason?" The sheriff's voice was grave. "There's a situation in town you should know about. Victor Blackwood has called a community meeting about the bear problem. He's stirring up a lot of sentiment against the local bear population, talking about attacks, property damage, danger to tourists." Mason frowned. "What's his angle?" "His resort plans. He's arguing that the bear population needs to be managed before his resort can safely open. He's pushing for expanded hunting permissions, maybe even a targeted removal operation." "That's ridiculous," Mason said. "The bears here are generally non-aggressive." There hasn't been a serious incident in years. A heavy pause filled the line. There was one, 8 years ago. Blackwood's son, Michael. He was killed in a bear attack while camping with his scout troop. The information landed like a stone in Mason's stomach. I didn't know. Most people avoid mentioning it around him, but it's why he's got this vendetta. Meetings at noon at the town hall. Thought you might want to be there, given your background. After ending the call, Mason relayed the conversation to Eleanor. I remember that tragedy, she said quietly. It was awful. The boy wandered away from the campsite. By the time they found him, she shook her head. But using that to justify a wholesale removal of bears from the region is misguided. Mason glanced at the cub, now sleeping peacefully in a nest of towels. I can't leave him for that long. I'll stay, Eleanor offered. You should go. You were a respected wildlife biologist before. She paused. Well, before, your voice would carry weight. Mason hesitated. He'd avoided public gatherings for years, avoided anything that might require him to step back into his former identity. But the thought of Blackwood's plan sent a protective surge through him. All right, he finally agreed. But I'll be back as soon as possible. The River Point Town Hall was a modest brick building that had served the community for over a century. By the time Mason arrived, the main meeting room was packed. He slipped in quietly, taking a position against the back wall. Victor Blackwood commanded attention at the front of the room. Tall, distinguished, with silver threading his dark hair, he projected authority in his tailored suit. Mason recognized the polished presentation style of a man accustomed to getting his way. 3 reported sightings within a mile of the elementary school, Blackwood was saying. It's only a matter of time before another tragedy occurs. My own son's death should have been a wake-up call for this community. Sheriff Harrison stood nearby, his expression carefully neutral. Margaret Wilson sat in the front row, her walking stick propped against her chair, her shrewd eyes assessing Blackwood. The Blackwood Resort will bring jobs and prosperity to River Point, Blackwood continued. But tourists won't come if they feel threatened. I'm proposing a comprehensive management plan, expanded hunting permits, professional removal of problem bears, and clearing of den sites within 5 miles of the resort property. Mason felt his jaw tighten. What Blackwood proposed wasn't management, it was elimination. Margaret Wilson raised her walking stick. I'd like to hear from someone who actually knows these animals before we start shooting them, she said, her voice carrying surprising strength. Isn't Dr. Reynolds in the back there? He studied bears for years at the university. Heads turned. Mason felt a flush of discomfort as eyes found him. Dr. Reynolds abandoned his position years ago, Blackwood said smoothly. I'm not sure his expertise is current. Mason stepped forward, surprising himself. Black bears are generally non-aggressive, he said, voice steady despite his racing heart. They avoid human contact when possible. The incident rate in this region is among the lowest in the country. Blackwood's expression hardened. Tell that to my son, Dr. Reynolds. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Mason took a breath. I'm deeply sorry for your loss, Mr. Blackwood, truly. But broad elimination of the bear population isn't the answer. These animals are vital to our ecosystem. And what do you propose instead? Blackwood challenged. Wait until another child dies? Education, proper food storage, wilderness awareness programs. The same approaches that have successfully reduced incidents in other regions. Blackwood laughed without humor. Academic solutions from an academic who hides in the woods. He turned to the crowd. I've already secured preliminary approval from the State Wildlife Agency. The first phase of our management plan begins next week. Mason felt a chill. How did you get approval so quickly? Sheriff Harrison shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Blackwood made a substantial donation to the Wildlife Agency's Research Foundation. You bought their approval, Mason said, anger rising. Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. I facilitated a mutually beneficial arrangement. Progress requires investment, Dr. Reynolds. After the meeting, Mason stood in the town square trying to process what had happened. A hand touched his arm. Margaret Wilson, her face lined with concern. "That man is dangerous," she said without preamble. "Not because he's evil, but because he's in pain and has the resources to act on it." Mason nodded. "I know. You've been hiding a long time, young man," Margaret continued. "Maybe it's time to step back into the light." Before Mason could respond, his phone rang. Eleanor's name flashed on the screen. "Mason, you need to get back here." Eleanor's voice was tight with worry. "The cub took a turn, and there's something else. I think there's someone watching your property." Mason drove back to his cabin with a sense of foreboding. As he turned onto his gravel drive, he noticed tire tracks that weren't his or Eleanor's. Someone else had been here. Inside, he found Eleanor bent over the cub, her expression grave. His temperature spiked. "The infection may have spread. Did you see who was watching the place?" Mason asked, moving to check on the cub. "Just glimpses. A man with binoculars in a dark SUV. Eleanor hesitated. "Mason, do you think Blackwood knows about the bears here?" "I don't see how he could." But unease settled in his stomach. If Blackwood discovered he was harboring an injured cub, with its mother keeping vigil outside, it would give him the perfect ammunition. The cub's breathing had become labored. Mason checked the wounds, finding one hot to the touch, angry red spreading from its edges. "He needs stronger antibiotics," Eleanor said. "I don't have the right ones with me." "The wildlife clinic in Ashton would have them," Mason said. "It's an hour drive." "I'll go," Eleanor offered. "You stay with them. If anyone from Blackwood's team comes around—" Mason nodded. "I'll keep them hidden." After Eleanor left, Mason sat beside the cub, applying cool compresses to bring down its fever. Outside, the mother bear paced anxiously, as if sensing her cub's distress. "He'll be okay," Mason told her through the window. "We're doing everything we can." As dusk approached, the sound of a vehicle on the gravel drive set Mason on edge. He quickly covered the cub's nest with a blanket and moved to the window. Not Eleanor's truck, a police cruiser. Sheriff Harrison. Mason opened the door before the sheriff could knock. "Sheriff?" Harrison removed his hat. "Mason, mind if I come in?" Mason hesitated, blocking the doorway. "Actually, I'm in the middle of something." Harrison's gaze was steady. "I think you know why I'm here." "I don't, actually." "One of Blackwood's security team reported seeing a bear hanging around your property. Given the current situation, I need to check it out." Mason considered his options. Lying to the sheriff would only make things worse. "The bear is here because her cub is injured. I've been trying to help it." Harrison's eyebrows rose. "You're harboring an injured bear cub. Mason, that's against state wildlife regulations without proper permits." "I know the regulations. I also know that cub would have died without intervention." A soft whimper came from beneath the blanket. Harrison's eyes shifted toward the sound. "Let me see," he said quietly. Mason led him to the blanket and pulled it back, revealing the cub's small form, chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Harrison studied the cub, then looked at Mason. "And the mother?" "She brought him to me. She's been watching from outside. I've never seen behavior like it." Harrison moved to the window, spotting the mother bear at the edge of the clearing. "Remarkable," he murmured. Then, more firmly, "But still illegal, Mason, and dangerous. If Blackwood finds out—" "I know." Mason ran a hand through his hair. "But I couldn't turn them away." Harrison was quiet for a long moment. My father was a game warden, he finally said. He taught me that sometimes what's right and what's legal aren't the same thing. He put his hat back on. I didn't see any bears here today. But Mason, be careful. Blackwood has eyes everywhere, and he won't show the same discretion. After the sheriff left, Mason returned to tending the cub, relief mingling with growing concern. He had an ally in Harrison, but Blackwood's influence reached far. If word got out about the bears at his cabin, it would become the perfect justification for Blackwood's elimination plans. As night fell, Eleanor returned with the antibiotics. Together, they administered the medicine to the weakened cub, then settled in to monitor its condition through the night. Sheriff Harrison was here, Mason told her. He knows about the bears. Eleanor looked alarmed. Will he report it? No, but he warned me about Blackwood's people watching the property. Outside, the mother bear continued her vigil, a dark silhouette against the night sky. Mason wondered what she understood of the danger gathering around them, not from nature but from human grief twisted into vengeance. We need to be ready, he told Eleanor. If Blackwood discovers them here, we'll have to move quickly. The cub isn't ready to return to the wild, but we might not have a choice. Eleanor nodded grimly. I've seen what happens when men like Blackwood decide an animal is a threat. It never ends well for the animal. As if understanding their conversation, the mother bear rose and moved closer to the cabin, her eyes reflecting the moonlight, fixed on the window where her cub lay fighting for life. In that steady gaze, Mason recognized something he'd forgotten existed. Unwavering devotion in the face of impossible odds. It reminded him painfully of Sarah and of himself before grief had taught him to stop caring so deeply. The cub's fever broke around dawn. Mason, who had dozed in his chair after Eleanor left, woke to find the small bear more alert than he'd been since arriving. Hope, as Mason couldn't help thinking of him, was trying to sit up, making soft, whimpering sounds that seemed more like hunger than pain. Well, good morning to you too, Mason said softly, checking the cub's temperature with the back of his hand. Normal. The stronger antibiotics had worked. Outside, the mother bear was already alert, watching the cabin with her usual intensity. When Mason approached the window with the cub visible in his arms, she rose onto her hind legs, nose twitching as if trying to catch her baby's scent through the glass. He's doing better, Mason told her, feeling only slightly foolish for speaking to a wild animal as if she could understand. A lot better. Over the next 3 days, the cub's recovery accelerated. He began taking small amounts of solid food, mashed berries, soft proteins, formula that Eleanor brought from the Wildlife Center supplies. His wounds were healing cleanly, and he'd started exploring his towel nest, testing his limbs with growing confidence. The mother bear's behavior evolved as well. She began making short forays into the surrounding forest, returning with berries and occasionally small fish that she would leave on the porch, offerings that Mason took as a sign of her growing trust. Eleanor continued checking the bear database, discovering more about F22211's history. She's had 3 litters before this one, she told Mason on her daily visit. But there's a gap in the tracking data for about 16 months a few years back. The researchers lost her signal. Mason was watching the cub attempt to climb onto a pillow. What happened when they found her again? That's the interesting part. When they re-established contact, she had migrated nearly 50 miles from her usual territory. No explanation why. Bears sometimes travel for food or new territory. True, but the timing is what interests me. Eleanor adjusted her glasses. The gap in tracking coincides with the period when there was a bear attack on a human in this region. Mason looked up sharply. Blackwood's son? Eleanor nodded. I'm not suggesting anything definitive. Many bears lost tracking signals during that period due to equipment issues, but it's a coincidence worth noting. The implications hung in the air between them. If F-2211 had been involved in Michael Blackwood's death, it would explain Victor's particular vendetta and make the current situation infinitely more volatile. That afternoon, Mason received another visitor, Margaret Wilson, arriving in her ancient blue pickup truck, a basket covered with a checkered cloth in her arms. "Thought you might need some real food," she announced, eyeing Mason's disheveled appearance critically. "You look like you've been sleeping in that chair for days." "I have been," Mason admitted, stepping aside to let her enter. He hesitated. "Margaret, there's something you should know before—" She brushed past him, then stopped abruptly at the sight of the bear cub curled on a blanket near the wood stove. "Well," she said after a moment, "that explains a few things." Mason closed the door quickly. "I can explain." "No need." Margaret set her basket on the kitchen counter, her expression unreadable. "Eleanor already told me." "She did?" Margaret began unpacking the basket. Containers of stew, fresh bread, a jar of preserves. "We've been friends for 40 years, young man. Did you think she wouldn't confide in me when something this extraordinary happened? I thought, given your position in the community, that I'd side with Blackwood?" Margaret snorted. "That man wouldn't know conservation if it bit him on the backside." She moved to look more closely at the cub. "Handsome little fellow, isn't he? And his mama's still out there?" Mason nodded, relief washing through him. "She's been keeping watch since she brought him here." Margaret peered out the window, spotting the mother bear at the forest edge. "Extraordinary," she murmured. Then, more briskly, "Well, I didn't just come to feed you. I came to warn you. Blackwood's hired men from out of state, professional hunters. They're arriving tomorrow." Mason felt his stomach tighten. "How do you know?" "My nephew works at the River Point Inn. They've booked 6 rooms for a week." She fixed Mason with a stern look. "You need to be prepared, Mason. If they find out you're harboring these bears—" "I know." The cub had awakened and was watching them with curious eyes. "But he's not ready to be released yet." "And even if he was, the mother won't leave without him." Margaret studied him thoughtfully. "You know, when Sarah died, a lot of folks around here thought we'd lost you both. The man who came back from that funeral wasn't the same one who left." Mason looked away, uncomfortable with her directness. "But that man, the one who stood up to Blackwood at the meeting, the one who's risking everything for these bears, that's the Mason Reynolds I remember." She touched his arm gently. "Sarah would be proud." The mention of Sarah's name sent a familiar ache through Mason's chest, but it was different somehow. Less like a wound being reopened, more like scar tissue being acknowledged. "I need to ask you something," Mason said. "About Sarah's time at the Wildlife Center. Do you remember a bear cub called Shadow?" Margaret's eyes widened slightly. "The one with the crescent mark on her ear?" "Of course. Sarah was so proud of that rehabilitation. Used to show me pictures whenever she visited the store." She glanced toward the window. "You don't think—" "I'm not sure, but the timing fits. And the marking." Margaret shook her head in wonder. "Life has strange ways of coming full circle, doesn't it?" After Margaret left, Mason found himself thinking about her words. Had he really been so different before Sarah's death? He remembered the passionate conservationist he'd been, the man who would spend hours tracking bears through the forest, who would fight tirelessly for their protection. That evening, as the cub slept peacefully, Mason did something he hadn't done in 7 years. He opened the door to Sarah's study, the room he'd kept closed since her death, preserving it exactly as she'd left it. The scent hit him first, faint but still present, her lavender lotion, the old books she loved. Her desk remained organized in her particular way, research notes stacked neatly, color-coded tabs marking important pages. The wall above held photographs of their work, Sarah kneeling beside tranquilized bears during tagging operations, both of them at conservation conferences, Sarah bottle-feeding orphaned cubs. Mason moved to the desk, his fingers trailing over her handwriting on a notepad. Then he saw it, a photograph he'd forgotten. Sarah at the rehabilitation center, cradling a small black bear cub. The cub's ear was bandaged, but visible beneath the gauze was a distinctive crescent-shaped wound. Written on the back in Sarah's neat handwriting, "Shadow, 3 months, my special girl." Mason sat heavily in Sarah's chair, the photograph trembling in his hand. Could it really be the same bear? The odds seemed impossible. And yet, his phone rang, jolting him from his thoughts. Eleanor's name flashed on the screen. "Mason," her voice was urgent. "I just got off the phone with my contact at the wildlife agency. Blackwood's permit has been expedited. The hunters have authorization to begin culling bears tomorrow morning." Mason's mind raced. "We need to move the cub." To where? He's still too weak for release, and no wildlife center within 100 miles will take him with Blackwood watching everything. Mason looked at the photograph in his hand, Sarah's smile, the tiny bear in her arms. "I have an idea, but I'll need your help. And Margaret's." By morning, Mason had formulated a plan. The cub, though improving, still needed at least another week of care before he could survive in the wild. But with Blackwood's hunters arriving, they were out of time. Eleanor arrived early, her truck loaded with supplies. "I brought everything on your list." "But Mason, are you sure about this?" "It's risky." "It's our only option," Mason said, gently placing the cub in a specially prepared carrier. "If we can get them to the old fire tower on the ridge, they'll be safe until the cub is stronger. It's remote enough that Blackwood's people won't find them easily." "And you think the mother will follow?" Mason glanced out the window where the mother bear watched attentively. "I know she will." Margaret arrived next, her truck bed covered with a tarp. "Sheriff Harrison has Blackwood's hunters gathering at the south entrance to the forest," she reported. "That gives us a window to move north." They loaded the carrier into Margaret's truck, covering it carefully. Mason took one final look around his cabin, grabbing Sarah's photograph at the last moment and tucking it into his jacket pocket. "Stay in the back with him," he told Eleanor. "Keep him calm. Margaret and I will lead the way in my truck." As they prepared to leave, Mason approached the mother bear cautiously. She watched him with those intelligent eyes, her massive form tensed but not threatening. "We're taking him somewhere safe," Mason said softly. "You can follow us." "I promise I won't let anything happen to him." The bear made a soft, huffing sound, as if in acknowledgement. The small convoy set out, taking rarely used Forest Service roads to avoid detection. Mason drove slowly, constantly checking his rearview mirror. About half a mile from the cabin, he spotted her, the mother bear, moving through the forest parallel to the road, keeping pace with the vehicles. "She's following," he told Margaret, who nodded grimly. "Let's just hope Blackwood's men aren't watching these roads." They had traveled about 5 miles when Mason spotted it. A dark SUV parked at a crossroads ahead, 2 men with binoculars surveying the area. "Blackwood's people," he muttered, slowing the truck. Margaret straightened her shoulders. "Keep driving. Act normal. I'll handle this." As they approached, one of the men stepped into the road, hand raised for them to stop. Mason pulled over, heart pounding. The man approached Mason's window. "Roads closed ahead for wildlife management operations." Margaret leaned across Mason, her expression stern. "Wildlife management? On my delivery route?" "I don't think so, young man. I've been taking supplies to the fire tower crew every Tuesday for 20 years. The man hesitated, glancing at his partner. "We have orders, and I have perishables in this truck," Margaret cut him off. "Unless you want to explain to Victor Blackwood why his contractors won't have fresh supplies today, I suggest you let us pass." The mention of Blackwood's name worked. The man stepped back, waving them through with obvious reluctance. As they drove past, Mason kept his expression neutral despite his racing heart. "That was close," Margaret sniffed. Benefits of being the old lady everyone underestimates. But her hands were shaking slightly. They reached the base of the fire tower road by mid-morning. The tower itself, perched on a remote ridge, had been decommissioned years ago but was still structurally sound. More importantly, it offered a sheltered space high above the forest floor, with visibility in all directions. Eleanor met them at the base, the carrier containing the now agitated cub. "He's been restless the whole way. I think he senses his mother." As if on cue, a rustling came from the tree line. The mother bear emerged, her attention fixed on the carrier. She approached cautiously, stopping about 20 feet away. "Let's get everything up to the tower," Mason said quietly. "Then we'll deal with the reunion." It took an hour to transport all the supplies up the steep stairs to the tower's cabin. When everything was prepared, a sheltered corner with bedding, food, water, and medical supplies, Mason brought the carrier back down. The mother bear was waiting, her patience seemingly inexhaustible. Mason set the carrier down and opened its door, then backed away to where Eleanor and Margaret stood at a safer distance. The cub emerged hesitantly, blinking in the sunlight. He took a few wobbly steps, then spotted his mother. With a sound between a whimper and a squeal, he bounded toward her with surprising strength. The reunion brought unexpected tears to Mason's eyes. The mother bear gently nuzzled her cub, inspecting him thoroughly, making soft sounds of what could only be described as relief. The cub pressed against her, his small form dwarfed by hers, finally safe in his mother's presence. "What now?" Eleanor asked softly. Mason wiped his eyes quickly. "Now we help them stay safe until the cub is strong enough to travel. I'll stay in the tower. Keep watch." "You can't stay here alone," Margaret protested. "What if Blackwood's people find this place?" "They won't," Mason said with more confidence than he felt. "And I need you both in town, keeping tabs on their movements." After a lengthy debate, Eleanor and Margaret reluctantly agreed to Mason's plan. They would return with more supplies the next day, and Margaret would spread a carefully crafted story about Mason taking a trip to visit old colleagues, a plausible explanation for his absence. As they prepared to leave, Mason watched the bears. The mother had led her cub to a sunny spot near the base of the tower, where they were resting together, the cub occasionally nursing. It was a scene of such natural peace that it made the human threat seem all the more perverse. "Be careful, Mason," Eleanor said, touching his arm. "This isn't just about the bears anymore. Blackwood has made it personal." After they left, Mason climbed back up to the tower cabin and began setting up his observation post. From this height, he could see for miles across the rolling Blue Ridge Mountains, the forest spreading like a green sea beneath an endless blue sky. He unpacked the photograph of Sarah with the bear cub, propping it against the window frame. "I think we found your special girl, Sarah," he said softly. "And now her cub needs our help." As dusk fell, Mason watched the mother bear guide her cub to a den-like space beneath a fallen tree near the tower. She settled the cub inside, then took up a position where she could see both the den and the tower, her vigilance unbroken. Mason prepared for his first night on watch, a rifle across his knees, not for the bears but for those who would harm them. For the first time in 7 years, he felt the familiar clarity of purpose that had defined his life before tragedy struck. It was as if a long-dormant part of himself had awakened, called back to life by a mother's devotion and a cub's will to survive. In the growing darkness, Mason thought he saw movement at the forest edge, just a shadow, there and gone. He raised his binoculars, scanning carefully, but saw nothing more. Still, a sense of unease settled over him. The hunters were out there somewhere, and Mason couldn't shake the feeling that this temporary sanctuary wouldn't remain secret for long. Dawn broke with a symphony of birdsong, sunlight filtering through the fire tower's weathered windows. Mason woke with a start, momentarily disoriented before remembering where he was and why. He moved quickly to the observation window, scanning the clearing below. The mother bear was already awake, sitting protectively near the fallen log where her cub had spent the night. As Mason watched, the cub emerged, moving with noticeably more strength than the day before. The healing power of being reunited with his mother was evident in every bouncing step. For 3 days, Mason maintained his vigil. Eleanor and Margaret visited daily, bringing supplies and news from town. Blackwood's hunters had been systematically working through the southern forest, already capturing or killing 4 bears according to Eleanor's wildlife agency contacts. "They're being efficient and methodical," Eleanor reported grimly on her 3rd visit. "Moving in a grid pattern northward, I'd estimate they'll reach this ridge in another 2 days at their current pace." Mason studied the maps they'd spread across the tower's small table. "The cub's getting stronger, but he's not ready for a long journey yet. They need at least another 3 days. Margaret, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke. "I've been thinking about something. Blackwood's vendetta seems oddly specific. The way he talks about bears. It's personal beyond even what happened to his son." Eleanor nodded. "I've had the same thought. Mason, did you make any progress looking into whether F-2211 might have been involved in Michael's death?" Mason had spent the previous night reviewing the files Eleanor had brought from the Wildlife Agency database. "The timing aligns with her tracking gap," he admitted, "and the location is possible, about 15 miles from her known territory at that time, but there's no definitive link." "There might be," Margaret said slowly. "My late husband Robert worked search and rescue. He was part of the team that found Michael Blackwood. He never talked much about it, too upsetting, but he did mention something once about the bear that attacked the boy having distinctive markings." Mason felt a chill run through him. "Like a crescent scar on the ear?" Margaret nodded. "I can't be certain, but it might explain why Blackwood seems almost obsessed with eliminating the bears here, beyond what you'd expect even after such a tragedy." The implications hung heavily in the small cabin. If the mother bear below, Sarah's shadow, was responsible for Michael Blackwood's death, their situation was even more precarious than they'd realized. "It doesn't change anything," Mason finally said. "What happened to Michael was a tragedy, but bears defend their territory and their young. It's their nature. Blackwood's vendetta is misplaced." "Try telling him that," Eleanor said softly. That evening, after Eleanor and Margaret had left, Mason sat watching the mother bear and her cub. The little one was practicing climbing on the fallen log, occasionally tumbling off in a way that would have been comical under different circumstances. The mother watched attentively, occasionally nudging him back to try again. Mason found himself thinking about Sarah, about the passion she'd had for these animals. "They're not the monsters people make them out to be," she'd told him once after a community meeting where locals had expressed fear about bear sightings. "They're mothers and fathers and children, just trying to survive in a world that's increasingly hostile to them." A sound from the forest edge snapped Mason back to alertness. He raised his binoculars, scanning the tree line. Nothing visible, but his instincts told him something was wrong. The mother bear had sensed it too. She was now on all fours, head raised, testing the air. In one fluid motion, she herded her cub back into the den beneath the fallen log, then positioned herself in front of it, facing the forest. Mason grabbed his rifle and headed for the stairs. Whatever was coming, he wouldn't watch it unfold from a distance. He had descended halfway down the tower when he spotted them. 3 men in camouflage moving through the forest, rifles ready. Blackwood's hunters had found them 2 days earlier than expected. Mason continued down, moving as quietly as possible, and positioned himself behind a large oak tree. From here, he could see the mother bear, still guarding her cub's hiding place, and the approaching hunters. "There she is," one of the men said, raising his rifle. "Big female, just like Blackwood described." "Wait," another cautioned. "The order was to tranquilize first, if possible. He wants confirmation before termination." "Why? A bear's a bear." "Not to him. This one's special somehow. Has some kind of mark he's looking for." The third man raised a tranquilizer gun. "Either way, she's coming with us. On 3. Mason stepped out from behind the tree, his rifle raised. "That's far enough, gentlemen." The men swung around, weapons half raised before registering Mason's aimed rifle. "Who the hell are you?" demanded the first hunter. "Mason Reynolds. This is private conservation land, and you're trespassing." The men exchanged glances. "We have permits from the State Wildlife Agency," the one with the tranquilizer gun said. "Authorized bear removal operation." "Not on this property," Mason bluffed. "You need to leave." The first hunter narrowed his eyes. "You're that biologist Blackwood mentioned, the one harboring bears." He smiled unpleasantly. "He'll be real interested to know we found you. And his special bear." Behind them, the mother bear growled, a deep rumbling sound that vibrated through the clearing. She hadn't charged yet, but her posture had shifted from defensive to threatening. "I'm giving you one chance to walk away," Mason said, keeping his voice steady despite his pounding heart. "This doesn't have to escalate." "Actually, it does," came a new voice from the forest edge. Victor Blackwood stepped into the clearing, flanked by 2 more armed men. He was dressed for the outdoors in expensive hunting attire, but his polished appearance seemed out of place in the wild setting. "Mr. Reynolds," he said coldly, "I suspected you might be involved when our trackers lost the trail near your property." Mason kept his rifle raised, though he now faced 5 armed men. "This has gone far enough, Blackwood. Your vendetta against these animals is misguided." "Misguided?" Blackwood's voice sharpened. "Do you know what a bear like that did to my son? Do you know what it's like to hold your child's mangled body in your arms?" "I know tragedy," Mason said quietly. "I know what it means to lose family, but killing innocent animals won't bring your son back." Blackwood's expression hardened. "That bear is far from innocent, Reynolds. Show him," he ordered one of his men, who produced a tablet and pulled up an image. It was a wildlife camera photo, grainy but clear enough. A female black bear with a distinctive crescent scar on her ear, standing over what appeared to be a small human form on the ground. "This was taken the day my son died," Blackwood said, his voice tight with controlled rage. "The last image of Michael alive, captured by his own camera before that monster killed him." Mason felt sick. The photo seemed to confirm their fears. The mother bear, now protecting her cub, was indeed the one who had killed Michael Blackwood. But something about the image bothered him. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the tablet. After a moment's hesitation, Blackwood nodded to his man, who handed the device to Mason. Mason studied the photo carefully, drawing on his years of wildlife biology training. The bear's posture wasn't aggressive, it was defensive. And the setting— "This was taken at a den site," he said finally. "The leaf litter pattern, the rock formation in the background. Your son stumbled upon her den." "What difference does that make?" Blackwood demanded. "She killed him." "It makes all the difference," Mason insisted. "Bears don't attack humans unprovoked, especially not one that had been rehabilitated by humans. She was defending her cubs." "She's a killer, and she's about to face justice," Blackwood said coldly, gesturing to his men. "Take her." The hunter with the tranquilizer gun raised his weapon, aiming at the mother bear, who growled more loudly, shifting her weight forward. "No!" Mason shouted, swinging his rifle toward the hunter. Everything happened at once. The hunter fired the tranquilizer dart. The mother bear charged. Mason lunged forward to intercept the hunters moving toward the bear. Blackwood shouted orders, and from the fallen log came a sound that froze everyone in place, the frightened cry of the bear cub. The mother bear, struck by the tranquilizer dart in her shoulder, staggered but continued her charge, crashing into the nearest hunter and sending him flying. 2 more darts hit her flank, but still she fought, driven by maternal instinct to protect her young. Mason had reached the fallen log, positioning himself between the hunters and the hidden cub. "Stop!" he shouted. "You've hit her with enough tranquilizer to take down an elephant." Indeed, the mother bear was now moving sluggishly, her massive form wavering. She turned toward Mason and the log where her cub hid, taking a few more determined steps before her legs buckled beneath her. She collapsed to the ground with a heavy thud, eyes still open but glazing over as the tranquilizers took effect. The cub, panicked by the commotion, darted from his hiding place, not toward his mother, but toward Mason, pressing against his legs as if seeking protection from the only other familiar presence. Blackwood stared at this tableau. Mason standing protectively over the frightened cub, the mother bear immobilized but still conscious, her eyes fixed on her young one. "Get the cub," Blackwood ordered one of his men. "No," Mason said firmly, raising his rifle again. "This ends now, Blackwood. Look at what's happening here. This cub trusts me because I saved his life. That mother trusted a human enough to bring her injured baby for help. These aren't mindless killers." "Step aside, Reynolds," Blackwood said, his own weapon now raised. "I've waited 8 years for this moment." "And what will it bring you?" Mason challenged. "Will killing this bear ease your pain? Will it bring Michael back? Don't you dare speak his name." "I'll speak it because someone needs to." Michael died in a tragic accident. He wandered into a bear's den. Any wild mother would defend her young. Blackwood's hand tightened on his rifle. "You don't understand. You couldn't possibly." "I understand loss better than you think," Mason said, his voice breaking slightly. "My wife was pregnant when she died. I lost my family too, Blackwood, but I didn't let it turn me into someone who destroys life out of vengeance." A tense silence fell over the clearing. The only sounds were the mother bear's labored breathing and the soft whimpering of the cub against Mason's legs. Blackwood's expression flickered, grief momentarily displacing rage. "Get out of the way, Reynolds. I won't ask again." "I can't do that." Blackwood raised his rifle, aiming at Mason. "Victor!" A new voice rang out. Eleanor emerged from the forest path, Sheriff Harrison beside her. "Don't do this!" Harrison had his service weapon drawn. "Put the rifle down, Mr. Blackwood." "This has gone too far." "This is a sanctioned wildlife operation," Blackwood said, though his rifle wavered slightly. "Not anymore," Harrison replied. "I've just received word from the state director. Your permits have been suspended pending investigation into allegations of bribery and undue influence." "That's absurd." "Is it?" Eleanor stepped forward, a folder in her hand. "I've been reviewing the research data on bear F2211, the bear you're so determined to kill, and I found something interesting in the timeline." She opened the folder, revealing a series of photographs. "These are images from the tracking collar camera, activated during periods of heightened activity. This sequence was recorded the day Michael died." Blackwood stared at the images, his face pale. "They show the bear with cubs at her den," Eleanor continued. "And then this." She pointed to an image of a young boy approaching the den, camera in hand. "Michael found her den, Victor. He was photographing the cubs." "No," Blackwood whispered. "He was attacked." "Yes, he was," Eleanor said gently, "but not because the bear was hunting him. He got too close to her cubs. Any mother would defend her young." Blackwood's rifle lowered slightly as he stared at the images. "There's more," Eleanor said. "The next images show something remarkable. After the initial defensive attack, the bear backed away. She didn't continue mauling Michael. She retreated with her cubs deeper into the den. If help had arrived sooner, she let the implication hang in the air." "Why wasn't I shown these?" Blackwood demanded, his voice hoarse. "They were only recovered recently when we recalibrated the tracking data," Eleanor explained. "The collar malfunctioned after the incident, but the data was still stored." Blackwood looked from the images to the tranquilized mother bear, now struggling to keep her eyes open as she watched her cub. 8 years, he said softly. 8 years of hating, of planning, of seeing that animal's face in my nightmares. "I know," Mason said quietly. "Grief does that, locks us in patterns we can't break free from. I've been there." The cub, perhaps sensing the shift in tension, cautiously moved toward his mother, still keeping close to Mason's legs as if for reassurance. Blackwood watched the cub's tentative movements, something changing in his expression. "He's afraid," he said, almost to himself, "but still trying to reach his mother." "Yes," Mason said. "Family is family, Blackwood, even for bears." A long moment passed. Then, with a visible effort, Blackwood lowered his rifle completely. "Stand down," he told his men, his voice rough with emotion. "We're done here." The hunters exchanged uncertain glances but lowered their weapons. Sheriff Harrison moved forward. "I'm going to need all of you to surrender your firearms and come with me. There are serious legal questions about this operation." As the hunters reluctantly complied, Blackwood remained standing, staring at the mother bear and her cub. The tranquilizers had nearly taken full effect now. The mother's eyes were closing despite her evident struggle to remain conscious. "Will she survive?" he asked Mason, his voice barely audible. "Yes," Mason said. "The tranquilizers will wear off in a few hours. She's strong." Blackwood nodded once, then turned away. His shoulders slumped. As Sheriff Harrison led him toward the path, he paused and looked back at Mason. "Michael loved animals, you know, especially bears. The cruel irony of it all." After they had gone, Eleanor approached Mason, who had knelt beside the mother bear, checking her breathing while her cub nuzzled anxiously at her face. "That was too close," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "If we hadn't found those images in time—" "How did you know to look for them?" Mason asked. "Margaret?" She remembered Robert mentioning a camera found with Michael. "When we heard Blackwood's hunters had been seen heading this way, we went straight to the Wildlife Agency archives." Mason gently stroked the mother bear's head, feeling the rough fur beneath his fingers. "She'll be all right," he told the anxious cub. "Just sleeping for a while." As they waited for the tranquilizers to wear off, Mason found himself thinking about Sarah again. "She would have loved this," he said softly to Eleanor. "Seeing her shadow again, with a cub of her own." Eleanor smiled, tears in her eyes. "She's seeing it, Mason, in her way." The sun was setting when the mother bear finally began to stir, the golden light bathing the clearing in warm hues. Her cub, who had remained faithfully by her side with Mason and Eleanor keeping watch from a respectful distance, perked up immediately, pawing gently at his mother's face. Slowly, groggily, the mother bear raised her massive head, blinking as she regained consciousness. Her first act was to nuzzle her cub thoroughly, checking him over as if ensuring he was unharmed. Then, remarkably, she turned her gaze to Mason. In that moment, as their eyes met across the clearing, Mason felt a connection that transcended the natural boundaries between human and wild. There was recognition there, an impossible understanding that defied explanation. Was it possible she remembered Sarah somehow? Or was it simply the recognition of one grieving soul by another? Either way, As the mother bear laboriously rose to her feet and led her cub toward the deeper forest, pausing once to look back at Mason, he felt something shift within him, a healing of sorts, a reconnection with the world he'd withdrawn from for so long. "Goodbye, Shadow," he whispered. "Take care of your little one." The aftermath of the confrontation came swiftly. Mason, Eleanor, and Sheriff Harrison stood in the gathering dusk, watching as Blackwood and his hunters were escorted down the mountain. The mother bear and her cub had disappeared into the deepening shadows of the forest, leaving behind only trampled grass and paw prints as evidence of their presence. "It's not over," Sheriff Harrison warned, holstering his weapon. "Blackwood has influence. He'll fight this." Eleanor nodded grimly. "At least we have the truth now. Those images change everything." Mason remained silent, staring at the spot where the bears had vanished. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation was ebbing, leaving him drained and unexpectedly vulnerable. He'd stood between armed men and a wild animal prepared to die if necessary. The realization shook him. "Mason?" Eleanor touched his arm gently. "Are you all right?" "I don't know," he admitted. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, distant, unfamiliar. "I need to." Whatever he needed remained unspoken as a wave of dizziness washed over him. He staggered, one hand reaching out to steady himself against the fire tower's weathered support beam. "Mason!" Eleanor's voice sharpened with concern. He looked down, surprised to see a dark stain spreading across his shirt. "I think," he began, then noticed the tear in the fabric, the jagged wound beneath. "I think I've been shot." The memory surfaced hazily. The chaos of the mother bear's charge, the hunters firing wildly, a burning sensation along his side that adrenaline had masked until now. "My God!" Eleanor gasped. "Harrison! He's wounded!" The sheriff rushed to Mason's side as his knees buckled. Together they lowered him to the ground, Harrison already calling for emergency services on his radio. "Stay with us, Mason," Eleanor urged, pressing her wadded-up jacket against the wound. "Help is coming." Mason tried to focus on Eleanor's face, but it kept blurring, shifting. Behind her, he thought he saw movement at the forest edge. A large, dark shape, watching shadow, or a hallucination born of blood loss and trauma. "The bears," he murmured. "Make sure they're safe." "Don't worry about the bears now," Eleanor said, her voice tight with worry. "Just stay awake." But darkness was encroaching around the edges of his vision, the pain giving way to a spreading numbness. Mason thought of Sarah, of the daughter they never had, of the mother bear and her cub disappearing into the forest. Circles within circles, endings and beginnings intertwined. "Sarah," he whispered, uncertain if he spoke aloud or only in his mind. "I understand now." Then the darkness claimed him. Mason drifted through shadows and light. Voices came and went, urgent at first, then calmer, professional. He caught fragments: significant blood loss, surgery, lucky the bullet passed through. A steady beeping accompanied these disembodied voices, grounding him when consciousness threatened to slip away entirely. In this liminal state, memories flowed like water. Sarah laughing as they tracked bears through summer forests, the phone call that shattered his world, the rainy funeral where he stood numb and disbelieving, the mother bear's intelligent eyes watching him through the cabin window. Sometimes in this haze, he thought he saw Sarah sitting beside his bed, her hand warm on his, her voice gentle. "It's not time yet, Mason. There's still work for you to do." Other times, strangely, he thought he saw the mother bear, standing impossibly at his bedside, her dark eyes filled with the same patience she'd shown on his porch that first morning. When Mason finally emerged fully into consciousness, Sunlight was streaming through hospital blinds, casting striped shadows across a small vase of wildflowers on the bedside table. Eleanor dozed in a chair nearby, her silver hair falling loose from its usual braid. "Eleanor," he croaked, his throat dry and voice unfamiliar. She startled awake, relief washing over her face. "Mason! Thank God!" She fumbled for the call button. "The doctors need to know you're awake." "How long?" he managed. 3 days. She poured a small cup of water and helped him sip it. "The bullet nicked an artery. You lost a lot of blood before they could get you to surgery." The next hours passed in a blur of medical examinations, police statements, and visitors. Sheriff Harrison came, looking uncharacteristically disheveled, to take Mason's official statement about the shooting. Margaret Wilson arrived with homemade soup and stern instructions for his recovery. A parade of nurses checked vital signs and changed bandages with professional efficiency. But it was Dr. Winter's visit on the second day of his conscious recovery that truly jolted Mason back to full awareness. "I've been tracking F-2211 and her cub," she told him, sitting carefully on the edge of his hospital bed. "They've moved deeper into the protected forest, away from the areas Blackwood's people were hunting." "They're safe?" Mason asked, trying to sit up straighter despite the pain that lanced through his side. "For now." Eleanor's expression was guarded. "But there's been a complication." Mason tensed. "What kind of complication?" "Victor Blackwood?" She sighed heavily. "He's been released pending investigation. His lawyers are already spinning the narrative, claiming self-defense against the bear, painting you as an unstable recluse interfering with legal wildlife management." "That's absurd," Mason said, anger giving him unexpected strength. "There were witnesses." "You, Harrison." "I know, but Blackwood has powerful friends and a compelling personal story. The grieving father seeking justice for his son's death plays well in certain circles." Eleanor paused. "There's something else. The wound in your side. Ballistics confirmed it wasn't from the hunter's rifles." Mason frowned. "Then who?" "The bullet matched Blackwood's personal hunting rifle." Eleanor met his eyes steadily. "Mason, he shot you deliberately. And he's already building a defense claiming he thought you were threatening his men." The revelation settled heavily in Mason's chest. Not a stray bullet in the chaos, but a deliberate act. "He wanted me out of the way," Mason said quietly. "So he could kill Shadow." Eleanor nodded. "That's my read of the situation." "Where is he now?" "Back at his estate outside River Point. His resort project is temporarily suspended while all this plays out, but he's not giving up." Eleanor hesitated. "There's been talk around town. Some people are siding with him, saying the bears are dangerous, that you've been obsessed since Sarah died." Mason closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of small-town judgment. "And the others?" "Others remember the conservationist you were, the man Sarah loved. They're rallying behind you. Margaret's been particularly vocal, organizing a community meeting about bear conservation." A small smile touched Eleanor's lips. "She's quite formidable when she gets going." Despite everything, Mason felt a warmth spreading through him. He'd withdrawn so completely after Sarah's death that he'd forgotten what it meant to have a community stand with you. "There's one more thing," Eleanor said, reaching into her bag. "This was found near where you fell." She handed him a small object, a smooth, polished river stone. Mason turned it over in his palm, puzzled, until he saw what made it unique. Pressed into one side was the perfect impression of a small bear paw. "A bear track stone," Eleanor explained. "They're rare, formed when a bear steps into certain types of clay near mineral springs. The clay hardens over time, preserving the print." Mason stared at the stone, running his thumb over the tiny paw impression. "Where did it come from?" "No one knows. It wasn't there before the confrontation. Sheriff Harrison found it afterward, right beside where you collapsed. Mason curled his fingers around the stone, a strange emotion welling in his chest. "Shadow," he whispered. It wasn't possible, of course. And yet, on the 5th day, against medical advice but with a stubbornness that surprised even himself, Mason checked out of the hospital. Eleanor drove him not to his remote cabin, but to her own home, a practical, sunlit house at the edge of town where she could keep an eye on his recovery. "The doctor said 6 weeks minimum before you're back to full strength," she reminded him as she helped him settle into the guest room. "And that's assuming no complications." Mason nodded absently, his mind elsewhere. Since waking in the hospital, a restlessness had taken hold of him. Not the isolation he'd sought after Sarah's death, but its opposite, a need to engage, to act, to protect. That evening, as they sat on Eleanor's porch watching fireflies rise from the summer grass, Mason finally voiced what had been building inside him. "I can't let Blackwood win," he said quietly. "Not just for Shadow and her cub, but for all of them, for what Sarah believed in." Eleanor studied him, her weathered face thoughtful in the fading light. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking it's time I stopped hiding." Mason's hand went to his side, where the wound throbbed dully beneath bandages. "Blackwood has money and influence, but we have the truth. And my voice, my credentials, still carry weight in conservation circles." "You want to fight him publicly?" "Yes." The decision, once spoken, felt right in a way nothing had for 7 years. "I want to use what happened, all of it, to push for permanent protection of the bear habitats in this region." Eleanor smiled, the expression transforming her face. "Sarah would be proud." "There's something else," Mason added hesitantly. "Something I can't explain, even to myself." He took the bear track stone from his pocket, turning it in the fading light. "I feel connected to them, Eleanor, to Shadow and her cub. Not just professionally or ethically, but spiritually," Eleanor suggested gently. Mason would have scoffed at such a notion before. Now he simply nodded. "It's as if everything, Sarah's work, my withdrawal, Blackwood's vendetta, that cub appearing on my porch, it's all connected somehow. I can't turn away from it." Eleanor reached over and covered his hand with hers. "Then don't." The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Margaret Wilson, accompanied by a younger woman Mason didn't recognize. "This is Diane Holloway," Margaret announced without preamble as Eleanor ushered them into the living room where Mason was resting. "Environmental lawyer, best in 3 states." Diane stepped forward, extending her hand. "Dr. Reynolds, I've read your research on bear habitat conservation. Impressive work." Mason shook her hand, bemused. "Thank you, but I haven't published in years." "Your older work remains relevant," Diane said briskly, "and your current situation has potential to set important precedents for wildlife protection against commercial development interests." "I've filled her in on everything," Margaret explained, settling into an armchair like she owned it. "And she thinks we have a case, not just against Blackwood personally for shooting you, but against his entire resort development plan." For the next hour, the 4 of them discussed legal strategies, conservation arguments, and community organizing. Despite his physical weakness, Mason felt more energized than he had in years, his mind engaging with the complexities of the fight ahead. The key, Diane emphasized, is the new evidence about Michael Blackwood's death. It transforms the narrative from dangerous predator kills innocent child to tragic accident occurs in bear's natural habitat. Combined with Blackwood's extreme response, hiring armed hunters, shooting you, it creates a compelling case for permanent habitat protection. As they talked, Mason noticed Eleanor watching him with a slight smile. "What?" he asked during a brief lull. "Nothing," she said, but her eyes were knowing. It's just good to see the old Mason again." Before Diane and Margaret left, they laid out action items. Mason would work with Diane on affidavits about bear behavior and habitat needs. Eleanor would coordinate with wildlife officials about shadows tracking data. Margaret would continue rallying community support. "Rest now," Margaret instructed Mason firmly as she departed. "We need you strong for the fight ahead." That night, Mason's dreams were vivid and strange. He walked through sun-dappled forest, following large paw prints in the soft earth. Ahead, always just out of clear sight, moved a dark shape, shadow, leading him deeper into the wilderness. The dream shifted, and Sarah was beside him, her hand warm in his. "You're finding your way back," she said, her voice as clear as if she stood beside him in waking life. "I miss you," he told her, the words carrying all the grief of 7 years. "I know." Her smile was gentle, understanding. "But you're not meant to follow me yet. There's healing to be done, yours and others." Mason woke with tears on his face but a curious peace in his heart. Outside, dawn was breaking over the Blue Ridge Mountains, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. For the first time in 7 years, he felt Sarah's presence, not as a wound, but as a foundation, something to build upon rather than a ghost to flee from. A week into his recovery at Eleanor's house, Sheriff Harrison arrived with troubling news. Blackwood had escalated his campaign, hiring a public relations firm to portray himself as the victim, a grieving father harassed by an unstable former academic with a vendetta against progress. "He's giving interviews to sympathetic media outlets," Harrison said grimly, painting the resort as an economic salvation for the region and conservation concerns as elitist interference. "Is it working?" Mason asked. Harrison's expression was somber. "With some people, yes. Jobs are scarce around here. The promise of economic development is powerful." "Then we need to offer an alternative," Mason said, an idea forming. "Not just opposition to the resort, but a positive vision for the region." That afternoon, still moving carefully due to his healing wound, Mason sat at Eleanor's dining room table with maps spread before him. By evening, he had outlined a proposal for a bear conservation center and ecotourism initiative, one that would create sustainable jobs while protecting the region's wildlife. When he presented the concept to Eleanor, her eyes lit up. "This could work, Mason. It addresses the economic concerns while preserving the habitat." "It's just a framework," he cautioned. "It would need investment, community buy-in." "Details," Eleanor waved dismissively. "The vision is sound and timely." The next day brought news that made the proposal even more urgent. Blackwood had managed to get his hunting permits reinstated through political connections, and his team was preparing to resume their bear management operations within days. "We're running out of time," Mason told Diane during an emergency strategy call. "If they find Shadow and her cub—" "I understand," the lawyer assured him. "I'm filing for an emergency injunction today, but Mason, we need you to make a public statement. Your credentials, combined with your personal experience with these bears, could sway public opinion." Mason hesitated only briefly. "Set it up." 2 days later, still pale and moving gingerly, Mason stood before local news cameras on the steps of the River Point Town Hall. Eleanor and Margaret flanked him supportively as he addressed the gathered crowd. "7 years ago, I withdrew from the world after losing my wife," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion behind the words. "I chose isolation over engagement, silence over advocacy. In doing so, I betrayed not only my own principles, but the passion my wife and I shared for protecting the natural world." He paused, gathering strength. "Recent events have awakened me from that self-imposed exile. When a mother bear brought her injured cub to my door seeking help against all natural instinct, I was reminded of what my wife always believed, that every life is connected, that compassion transcends species, that we have a responsibility to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Mason outlined the Conservation Center proposal, emphasizing the economic benefits alongside the environmental protections. As he spoke, he noticed movement at the back of the crowd. Victor Blackwood had arrived, his expression thunderous as he listened to Mason's speech. Mr. Blackwood believes this community must choose between prosperity and conservation, Mason continued, meeting Blackwood's gaze directly. I reject that false dichotomy. We can honor the memory of his son Michael while also protecting the natural world the boy loved. A murmur ran through the crowd at the direct reference to Michael. Blackwood's face flushed with anger. I extend my hand to Mr. Blackwood, Mason said, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed gathering. Your loss is unimaginable and your grief is valid, but the path of destruction you've chosen will not heal that wound. It will only create more suffering for the wildlife, for this community, and ultimately for yourself. As Mason concluded his remarks, a smattering of applause broke out, growing stronger as more people joined in. But he barely registered it, his attention fixed on Blackwood, who stood rigid at the back of the crowd, eyes locked with Mason's in a silent confrontation. Then, without warning, Blackwood turned and strode away, pushing roughly through the crowd to a waiting SUV. The vehicle peeled away with a squeal of tires, leaving Mason with a sense of foreboding. Whatever came next, Blackwood would not yield easily. That night, exhausted from the public appearance but unable to sleep, Mason sat on Eleanor's porch, the bear-track stone in his palm. The moon rose over the mountains, casting silver light across the landscape. Somewhere out there, Shadow and her cub were navigating the darkness, vulnerable to the hunters who would resume their search at first light. I don't know if I can save them, Mason whispered to the night. To Sarah's memory, to whatever force had brought the injured cub to his door that fateful morning. A sound from the edge of Eleanor's property drew his attention, a rustling in the underbrush that raised the hair on the back of his neck. Mason stood slowly, wincing at the pull of stitches in his side. "Hello?" he called softly, peering into the darkness. No answer came, but the rustling continued, moving closer. Mason's heart raced. It couldn't be. Not here, so close to town. But then she emerged into the moonlight, Shadow, her massive form unmistakable, the crescent scar on her ear visible even in the dim light. And beside her, bouncing with newfound strength, her cub. Mason stood frozen, barely breathing. They were 100 feet away, at the edge where Eleanor's manicured lawn met the wilder forest beyond. Close enough that he could see the intelligent awareness in Shadow's eyes as she regarded him steadily. "What are you doing here?" he whispered. "It's not safe." As if in answer, Shadow nudged her cub forward slightly. The little one took a few tentative steps, then dropped something on the ground before scampering back to his mother's side. Shadow gave Mason one final look, then turned and disappeared into the forest with her cub. When they had gone, Mason moved cautiously to the spot where the cub had left its offering. There, gleaming in the moonlight, was another river stone, this one bearing the perfect impression of a larger bear paw. Mason stood holding the second bear-track stone in the moonlight, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. Shadow and her cub, venturing this close to town, leaving this deliberate token, it defied every natural behavior pattern he'd studied throughout his career. He slipped both stones into his pocket and returned to Eleanor's house, unsure whether to wake her with this inexplicable development. By morning, he'd convinced himself that exhaustion and medication had created a waking dream, yet the stone remained, solid and real in his hand, its impression of a full-grown bear's paw, undeniable evidence of something he couldn't rationally explain. "You saw them?" Eleanor asked over breakfast, examining the stone with wonder. "Here, at the edge of my property?" "I know how it sounds," Mason admitted. "Bears don't behave this way. They don't leave gifts." Eleanor's eyes held a gleam of something beyond scientific curiosity. "Most bears? No. But Shadow isn't most bears, is she? She was raised by humans for a crucial period of development. She has associations with people that wild-born bears don't have." "Even so," Mason argued, "this level of cognitive behavior, recognizing me in a different location, deliberately leaving an object, it's unprecedented." "The world is full of mysteries, Mason," Eleanor said, returning the stone. "Not everything fits neatly into scientific categories." Before they could discuss it further, Mason's phone rang. Diane Holloway's name flashed on the screen. "Mason," she said without preamble, "we have a problem. Big one? Turn on the local news." Eleanor switched on the television, finding the regional news channel. Victor Blackwood's face filled the screen, his expression grave as he stood at a podium, deeply concerned about public safety, he was saying. "These new images confirm what I've been warning about for years." The broadcast cut to footage that made Mason's blood run cold. Night vision video of Shadow and her cub at the edge of Eleanor's property, exactly where Mason had seen them hours before. The timestamp showed 1:17 a.m. "These dangerous predators are now approaching residential areas," Blackwood continued. "Dr. Reynolds, despite his academic credentials, has irresponsibly habituated these animals to human presence, creating a public safety threat." The camera returned to Blackwood, now flanked by men in official-looking uniforms. "In light of this evidence, the State Wildlife Division has authorized immediate action. For the safety of River Point residents, these bears will be removed today." Mason felt the room tilt slightly. "They were tracking them," he realized aloud. "They followed Shadow here." "Mason!" Diane's voice came urgently through the phone. "I'm filing for an emergency stay, but it could take hours." "If Blackwood's people find those bears before then—" "I understand." Mason ended the call, already moving toward the door despite the pain in his side. "I need to find them first." Eleanor grabbed his arm. "You're in no condition to be hiking through the mountains." "I don't have a choice," Mason said, gently but firmly removing her hand. "Shadow came to me for a reason. I won't abandon her now." 30 minutes later, Mason was in Eleanor's truck, heading toward the fire tower where they had last confronted Blackwood's hunters. If Shadow had risked coming to town, something must have driven her from her deeper forest refuge. The fire tower offered the best vantage point to spot both bears and hunters. As he drove, Mason called Sheriff Harrison. "Have you seen Blackwood's announcement?" "Just now," Harrison confirmed, his voice grim. "I've got deputies watching the main forest access roads, but my jurisdiction is limited when it comes to state-authorized wildlife operations. Can you stall them?" "I'll do what I can. But Mason—" Harrison hesitated. "Be careful. Blackwood isn't just after the bears anymore. The way he looked when your name came up in the briefing. This is personal for him now." Mason ended the call as he reached the fire tower road. The wound in his side throbbed with every heartbeat, a constant reminder of how personal this had already become. The climb up the fire tower steps left Mason breathless and sweating, his wound screaming in protest. But the view from the top was worth the pain, a panoramic vista of forest, hills, and valleys stretching for miles. He raised his binoculars, methodically scanning for any sign of movement. After 20 minutes of searching, he spotted them, not Shadow and her cub, but Blackwood's hunters, a team of 4 men moving in a disciplined line through a valley about 2 miles east. Their methodical progress suggested they were following a trail. Mason swung his binoculars west, searching desperately for any sign of the bears. Nothing. He was about to scan another section when his phone vibrated. A text from Margaret. "Eastern Creek bed. Saw them 10 men ago." Margaret was out there somewhere, he realized with both gratitude and concern. She'd taken it upon herself to join the search. The Eastern Creek bed was barely visible from his position, a ribbon of silver occasionally glinting through the trees. If the bears were following it and the hunters maintained their current course, the two would intersect within an hour. Mason descended the tower stairs as quickly as his injured body would allow, grimacing against the pain. Back in the truck, he plotted the quickest route to intercept the creek before the hunters could reach it. The dirt road ended about a half-mile from where he needed to be. Mason parked and continued on foot, moving as quickly as he dared through the dense summer foliage. The humidity was oppressive, his shirt soon clinging to his back with sweat. The wound in his side had begun to seep blood again. He could feel the warm wetness spreading beneath the bandage. He had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when he heard it, a distinctive huffing sound he recognized immediately as a bear's warning call. Mason froze, listening intently. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by the crack of breaking branches. "Shadow?" he called softly, moving cautiously toward the sound. A flash of movement caught his eye, not the dark bulk of an adult bear, but the smaller form of the cub, darting between trees about 50 yards ahead. Mason followed, pushing through underbrush, ignoring the tearing pain in his side. He emerged into a small clearing beside the creek and found himself face to face with Shadow. She stood on all fours, tense and alert, her cub partially hidden behind her massive form. Her eyes fixed on Mason with that unsettling intelligence, but there was something new in her posture. Urgency, perhaps even fear. "They're coming," Mason told her, the absurdity of speaking to a wild animal lost in the desperate reality of the moment. "You need to move deeper into the forest." As if understanding, Shadow huffed again, but didn't retreat. Instead, she moved sideways, revealing what she had been partially blocking from view. A second, smaller bear cub, its fur matted with blood from what appeared to be a gunshot wound to its hindquarters. Mason stared in disbelief. Another cub? The reality crashed over him with stunning force. Shadow hadn't had just one cub, she'd had two. While one had been recovering in Mason's cabin, this one had been hidden somewhere in the forest. Now it was injured, explaining why Shadow had risked approaching town. She was seeking help again for her second offspring. "Oh, Shadow," Mason whispered, moving slowly toward the injured cub. "What happened?" The answer came in the form of shouts from the forest behind him. Blackwood's hunters were closer than he'd estimated, close enough that their voices carried through the trees. Shadow growled, a deep rumble that vibrated through the clearing. Her uninjured cub pressed closer to her leg, while the wounded one lay panting, unable to move quickly. Mason made a split-second decision. He shrugged off his light jacket, approaching the injured cub with slow, deliberate movements. "I'm going to help," he told Shadow, maintaining eye contact with the massive bear. "Like before. Trust me." To his amazement, Shadow remained still, watching intently as Mason knelt beside her wounded cub. And the little bear whimpered as Mason gently wrapped it in his jacket, creating a makeshift sling. "I've got you," he murmured to the frightened cub. "We need to move now," he told Shadow, rising carefully with his precious burden. "Follow me." Whether by some impossible understanding or mere coincidence, Shadow allowed Mason to lead, following with her healthy cub as he made his way upstream, away from the approaching hunters. The creek bed offered some cover, the sound of water masking their movements. They had traveled perhaps a quarter mile when Mason heard a shout much closer than expected. They'd been spotted. A crack split the air, followed by the whine of a bullet passing overhead. "Run!" Mason shouted to Shadow, though he knew she couldn't understand the word, but she seemed to grasp the urgency, herding her healthy cub ahead while keeping pace with Mason, who was struggling under the weight of the injured cub and his own wound. Another shot rang out, this one splintering bark from a tree just feet away. Mason pushed forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the edges of his vision beginning to darken from exertion and blood loss. Just as he felt his strength failing, a voice called from ahead, "Mason! This way!" Margaret Wilson stood on a rocky outcropping above the creek, gesturing urgently toward a narrow opening in the rocks behind her. Mason staggered toward it, Shadow and her cub following close behind. The opening led to a small cave, its entrance partially concealed by hanging vines. Inside, Margaret had prepared what looked like a makeshift camp. Blankets, a first aid kit, water bottles. "How did you know?" Mason gasped, carefully laying the injured cub on a blanket. "I didn't," Margaret admitted, helping Mason sit before he collapsed. "But I know these mountains. Known them all my life. Used to play in these caves as a girl." She glanced at Shadow, who stood tensely at the cave entrance, monitoring the forest beyond. "Never thought I'd be sharing one with a mama bear, though." Margaret turned her attention to the injured cub, examining the wound with surprising proficiency. Bullet grazed him. Painful, but not life-threatening if we can stop the bleeding. As she worked, Mason sank back against the cave wall, suddenly lightheaded. He looked down to see fresh blood soaking through his shirt. His own wound had reopened completely. "Margaret," he said weakly, "I need to sit down." She looked up sharply, noticing his pallor and the spreading stain. "Lord have mercy, Mason. You're bleeding out." Before she could move to help him, voices echoed from outside. The hunters had tracked them to the creek. "Stay still," Margaret whispered, reaching into her bag and pulling out, to Mason's astonishment, a small revolver. "Robert's old service weapon," she explained at his expression. "Never thought I'd need it, but I'm glad I brought it today." Shadow had gone perfectly still at the cave entrance, her massive body blocking most of the opening, her healthy cub pressed against her side. Her posture radiated tension, a mother prepared to defend her young at any cost. The voices grew closer. Through the small gap around Shadow's form, Mason could see figures moving along the creek bed, 3 men with rifles, scanning the area methodically. "They're going to find us," Mason whispered. "And when they do—" Margaret's grip tightened on the revolver. "I won't let them hurt these bears. Or you." The reality of their situation hit Mason with sudden clarity. They were trapped in a cave with a wounded bear cub, a protective mother bear, and 3 armed men closing in. His own strength was fading rapidly, blood continuing to seep from his reopened wound. Even if Margaret could somehow hold off the hunters with her small revolver, Mason might not survive long enough for help to arrive. As if sensing his despair, Shadow turned her massive head toward him. Their eyes met in that strange, impossible connection that had defined their relationship from the first moment on his porch. In her gaze, Mason saw not the mindless aggression Blackwood attributed to her kind, but a deep, knowing intelligence, and something else he couldn't name, something ancient and profound. The moment was broken by a new voice outside, not one of the hunters, but equally unwelcome. "Reynolds!" Victor Blackwood's voice echoed against the rocks. "I know you're here somewhere. My men tracked you to this area." Mason exchanged a glance with Margaret, who shook her head in warning, her finger moving to the revolver's trigger. "This has gone far enough," Blackwood continued, closer now. "You're injured. You need medical attention. Come out, and I give you my word you won't be harmed." "And the bears?" Mason called weakly, ignoring Margaret's frantic gesture to remain silent. A pause. "The bears are dangerous predators, Reynolds. You know that better than anyone. Your emotional attachment to them is clouding your scientific judgment. Shadow shifted at the sound of Blackwood's voice, a low growl rumbling in her chest. Her uninjured cub pressed closer to her, while the wounded one whimpered softly from the blanket. "They're not what you think they are, Blackwood," Mason called, his voice stronger now, despite his weakening body. "They're not mindless killers. They're mothers and children, just trying to survive. They killed my son." Blackwood's voice cracked with emotion. "That bear, the one you're protecting, she tore my boy apart." "She was protecting her cubs," Mason replied. "Just like she's doing now. Just like any mother would." He took a painful breath. "Your son wandered into her den, Blackwood." Well, it was a tragic accident, not a malicious attack. Silence fell outside the cave. Then footsteps approached. A single set, moving cautiously. Shadow tensed further, her fur bristling, but she remained at the cave entrance, neither retreating nor charging. "I'm coming in," Blackwood announced. "Alone. My men will stay back." Margaret raised the revolver, aiming at the narrow opening. "Don't do it," she warned. But Shadow, in a move that left both humans speechless, shifted slightly to one side, not moving away entirely, but creating just enough space for a person to enter. Victor Blackwood appeared in the gap, his tall figure silhouetted against the forest beyond. His eyes widened at the tableau before him. Mason slumped against the wall, blood soaking his shirt. Margaret, with her revolver trained steadily on Blackwood's chest, the injured bear cub on a blanket, and most stunning of all, Shadow standing mere feet away, watching him with those intelligent eyes. "My God," Blackwood whispered. "Don't come any closer," Margaret warned, the revolver unwavering. Blackwood raised his hand slowly. "I'm unarmed." His gaze moved from Shadow to Mason. "You're bleeding badly, Reynolds." "Observant," Mason managed, the edges of his vision growing darker. "Let me help you," Blackwood said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Whatever our differences, I don't want your death on my conscience." "And them?" Mason nodded toward Shadow and her cubs. "What about their deaths on your conscience?" Blackwood's expression tightened. "That bear killed my son." "Look at her, Blackwood," Mason said softly. "Really look. She's protecting her children, just like she was 8 years ago. Your son's death was a tragedy, but it wasn't murder. It was the natural response of a mother defending her young." Something shifted in Blackwood's face, a flicker of doubt, perhaps even recognition. He looked at Shadow, really looked at her, seeing beyond his grief and rage for perhaps the first time. Shadow stared back, neither aggressive nor submissive, simply present, a mother facing the man who threatened her family. "The images," Blackwood said finally, "the ones from Michael's camera. I've spent 8 years avoiding looking at them closely. I couldn't bear to see." He swallowed hard. "But last night, after your speech, I forced myself to review them all. Every frame." Mason waited, sensing something crucial in Blackwood's halting confession. "He was excited about finding the den," Blackwood continued, his voice thick with emotion. "You can see it in the earlier photos, his notes in the margins about wanting to get closer pictures of the cubs. Michael loved bears, studied them constantly. He knew the risks of approaching a den, but he was just a boy. Excited, impulsive." Blackwood's shoulders sagged, the rigid anger that had defined him for years suddenly absent. "Oh, it wasn't the bear's fault. It was mine, for letting him go into those woods without proper supervision, for not teaching him better, for not being there when he needed me." The admission hung in the air, powerful in its vulnerability. Margaret lowered the revolver slightly, her expression softening with something like compassion. Shadow made a soft, huffing sound, drawing everyone's attention. She moved toward her injured cub, sniffing gently at the wound Margaret had bandaged. Then, in a gesture that defied explanation, she turned back to Blackwood and made the same sound, not threatening, almost like communication. Blackwood stared at her, transfixed. "What is she doing?" "I think," Mason said weakly, "she's acknowledging your loss, your cub, her cub, the connection between you." It was impossible, of course. Bears didn't understand human grief, didn't make such complex cognitive connections. And yet, as Shadow continued to hold Blackwood's gaze, something unspoken seemed to pass between them, a recognition of shared pain that transcended species. The moment was broken by Mason's sudden gasp as a wave of pain and dizziness washed over him. He slumped further against the wall, the blood loss finally taking its toll. "He needs a hospital," Margaret said urgently. "Now!" To her surprise, Blackwood moved forward, kneeling beside Mason. "My men have a medical kit, and there's a helicopter coming. I called it when we found your tracks." He glanced at Shadow, who had returned to her protective position by her cubs. "All of you need help." "Why would you help us?" Mason managed through gritted teeth. "The bears." Blackwood was silent for a moment. "Perhaps it's time to end this cycle of vengeance," he said finally. "It hasn't brought Michael back. It hasn't eased my grief. It's only created more suffering." He looked at Shadow again. "She saved her cub by bringing it to you. A conscious choice to trust a human for the sake of her child." He reached a decision, turning to call toward the cave entrance. "Johnson, we need the medical kit in here. And tell the others to stand down. No one fires a weapon. Is that clear?" Within minutes, one of Blackwood's men had brought a comprehensive first aid kit, working under Margaret's watchful eye to stabilize Mason's wound. Outside, the distinctive thrum of helicopter blades grew steadily louder. "The clearing by the creek is big enough for them to land," Blackwood said. "But we need to move quickly." The problem of the bears remained. Shadow would not abandon her injured cub, and the other one would not leave its mother's side. "We need to take them too," Mason insisted, stronger now that his bleeding had been controlled. "The cub needs veterinary care." Blackwood hesitated, then nodded. "I'll call ahead. Have wildlife specialists meet us at the hospital." "But Reynolds," he met Mason's eyes. "After they're treated, they need to return to the wild where they belong. No more interference in their natural behavior." It was the scientist in Blackwood speaking now, not the grieving father, and Mason recognized the truth in his words. His attachment to Shadow and her cubs had crossed professional boundaries, perhaps even endangering them by habituating them further to human presence. "Agreed," Mason said finally. "Once they're healed." Together, the unlikely alliance prepared to move. Blackwood and his man constructed a makeshift stretcher for Mason from branches and a blanket. Margaret and Mason carefully wrapped the injured cub for transport. Shadow watched it all with her uncanny attentiveness, seemingly understanding that these humans, even the one who had hunted her, were now trying to help. As they emerged from the cave into the sunlight, the helicopter circled overhead, preparing to land in the nearby clearing. Shadow hesitated at the cave entrance, clearly alarmed by the noise and wind. "She won't follow with that thing there," Mason said, gesturing to the helicopter. "She's too frightened." Blackwood looked from the bears to the helicopter, then made a decision. He pulled out his radio. "Tell the pilot to hold position above the clearing. Don't land yet." He turned to Mason. "We'll get you to the helicopter first. Then I'll have my men create a safe corridor for the wildlife team to help with the bears." Mason shook his head weakly. "She won't trust your men. She barely trusts me. And I saved her cub." "Then what do you suggest?" The answer came not from Mason, but from Margaret. "We need to let her decide," she said simply. "Show her the way, give her the option, and let her make her choice." It was so straightforward, so obvious that both men stared at her. Margaret shrugged. Wild things need to make their own decisions. That's what makes them wild. And so, as Mason was carried toward the clearing on the makeshift stretcher, Shadow was given space to follow or stay. Her choice, her agency respected at last. The healthy cub remained close to her side, while Margaret gently carried the injured one. To everyone's amazement, Shadow followed, cautiously, stopping often to assess the situation, but steadily moving toward the clearing where the helicopter hovered. Whether driven by maternal instinct to stay with her injured cub or by some deeper understanding, she chose to continue this strange journey with the humans who had both threatened and saved her family. As they reached the clearing's edge, Blackwood made one final radio call. The helicopter descended slowly, its downdraft bending the grass and wildflowers. Shadow stopped, trembling visibly at the unnatural wind and noise, but did not retreat. "Remarkable," Blackwood murmured, genuine wonder replacing the hatred that had driven him for so long. "Oh, absolutely remarkable." In that moment, as human and bear stood together in the summer sunlight, something shifted in the forest of the Blue Ridge Mountains. A wound beginning to heal, a cycle of vengeance breaking, a new understanding taking root where only fear and hatred had grown before. 6 months later, Mason stood on the wooden observation deck overlooking the valley, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp December air. The first snow of winter had dusted the Blue Ridge Mountains overnight, transforming the landscape into a pristine canvas of white and gray. He adjusted the focus on his binoculars, scanning the tree line below with practiced patience. "Any sign of them?" Eleanor asked, joining him at the railing. Her silver hair was tucked beneath a bright red knit cap, her cheeks pink from the cold. "Not yet," Mason replied, "but the tracking collar showed activity in this area yesterday." They stood in comfortable silence, two scientists united by their love for these mountains and the creatures that called them home. The observation deck was one of 5 recently constructed throughout what was now officially designated as the Blue Ridge Bear Conservation Area, 3,000 acres of protected forest funded through an unlikely partnership between private conservation groups and Blackwood Enterprises. The transformation of the past 6 months still amazed Mason. That day in the forest clearing had marked the beginning of something none of them could have predicted. Mason had been airlifted to the hospital, his condition critical but stable. The wounded bear cub had been transported separately to a wildlife medical facility. And most remarkably, Shadow and her healthy cub had been safely relocated deeper into the forest by a specialized wildlife team, with Victor Blackwood himself supervising the operation. Mason's recovery had been slow. The reopened wound resulted in a serious infection that kept him hospitalized for nearly 3 weeks. During that time, visitors had rotated through his room, Eleanor bringing research updates, Margaret offering homemade soup and practical wisdom, Sheriff Harrison providing community news, and, most surprisingly, Victor Blackwood. The resort developers' visits had been awkward at first, 2 men connected by trauma and shared experience, but divided by years of different perspectives. Yet with each visit, the conversation had flowed more easily, particularly when centered on their new common purpose, protecting the bears and their habitat. "I've been reviewing the land surveys," Blackwood had said during one such visit, spreading maps across Mason's hospital tray table. "The eastern ridge has 3 identified den sites. If we reroute the conservation area boundary to include it..." Together, they had sketched a vision that combined elements of Mason's Conservation Center concept with a scaled-down version of Blackwood's resort, ecotourism that would bring visitors and economic benefits to River Point, while ensuring the bears remained protected in their natural habitat. "Michael would have loved this," Blackwood had admitted quietly one evening as they finalized the plans. He used to draw pictures of observation towers where people could watch bears without disturbing them. Now, 6 months later, those drawings had become reality. The observation deck where Mason and Eleanor stood was the first of several planned viewing areas, strategically placed to offer glimpses of wildlife while minimizing human impact on their behavior. "I still can't believe Blackwood gave up his luxury resort concept," Eleanor remarked, adjusting her scarf against the winter chill. "Diane said the profit margins on this ecotourism model are significantly lower." "It's not about profit for him anymore," Mason said, "or at least not entirely. The day in the cave changed something fundamental in him. I think he finally found a way to honor Michael's memory that feels right." A movement at the forest edge caught Mason's attention. He raised the binoculars quickly, focusing on a dark shape moving against the snow. "There," he said softly, passing the binoculars to Eleanor. "By the fallen pine." Eleanor watched for a moment, then smiled. "It's her. And look, both cubs." Mason took the binoculars back, his heart quickening as he spotted Shadow and her cubs foraging at the forest edge. Both young bears had grown considerably, their movements confident and playful as they explored the snowy landscape under their mother's watchful eye. The previously injured cub showed no sign of limping. The veterinary care had been successful, and the family had been reunited in the wild after both cubs were fully healed. "They're thriving," Mason said, unable to keep the emotion from his voice. "Against all odds." Eleanor patted his arm gently. "Not against all odds, Mason, because people like you refused to give up on them." They watched the bears for nearly 20 minutes before Shadow led her cubs deeper into the forest, disappearing among the snow-laden trees. Mason lowered the binoculars, a sense of profound rightness settling over him. "The tracking data has been fascinating," Eleanor commented as they began the walk back to the visitor center. "Shadow has established a territory that almost perfectly overlaps with the conservation boundaries, as if she somehow understands she's safer within them." "Bears are intelligent," Mason replied, though he knew that Shadow's behavior continued to defy simple scientific explanation. The memory of the bear track stones remained vivid in his mind, one now displayed in a shadow box on his cabin wall, the other carried in his pocket like a talisman. The visitor center came into view, a rustic yet modern structure built with sustainable materials and designed to blend with the natural surroundings. Inside, a small group of tourists was gathering for the afternoon guided hike, while children clustered around interactive displays about bear behavior and conservation. Margaret Wilson stood behind the welcome desk, her walking stick propped against the wall as she distributed trail maps and answered questions with the authority of someone who had known these mountains all her life. At 70, she had become the center's most beloved guide, her storytelling abilities and practical knowledge making her tours consistently overbooked. "There you are," she called when she spotted Mason and Eleanor. "Blackwood just called. He's bringing a group of potential donors this afternoon. Wants you to give your famous bear speech," she added with a wink at Mason. Mason groaned good-naturedly. "I've given that talk 3 times this week already." "And you'll give it 3 times more if it means more funding for the bears," Margaret replied firmly. "These are deep pockets he's bringing, environmental philanthropists from Chicago." "I'll be ready," Mason assured her, heading toward his office to review his presentation notes. The office was small but comfortable, its walls covered with maps of the conservation area, bear migration patterns, and tracking data. A framed photograph of Sarah stood on his desk, not the old one that had remained hidden away for years, but a vibrant image of her in the field, kneeling beside a tranquilized bear during a research project, her face alight with purpose and joy. Mason touched the frame briefly, a gesture that had become habit. "You'd love what we're doing here, Sarah," he murmured. The sharp ring of his office phone interrupted the moment. "Mason Reynolds," he answered. "Dr. Reynolds." Victor Blackwood's voice came through clearly. "I'm about 20 minutes out with the Harrington Foundation representatives. How's the bear activity today?" "Shadow and her cubs were visible from the north deck about an hour ago," Mason reported. "No guarantees they'll make another appearance, but the tracking collar shows they're still in the area." "Excellent. Mrs. Harrington is particularly interested in the tracking research. If we can secure their funding for the expanded monitoring program, I'll emphasize the scientific benefits," Mason assured him, "and the educational opportunities for local schools." After ending the call, Mason gathered his presentation materials and headed to the center's small auditorium. As he arranged his notes at the podium, he reflected on how completely his life had transformed since that morning when a desperate mother bear had appeared on his porch with her dying cub. The isolation he had clung to after Sarah's death had been replaced by community and purpose. His friendship with Eleanor had deepened into a partnership that bridged their generational gap with shared scientific passion. Margaret had become a surrogate mother figure, dispensing wisdom and occasional scolding with equal conviction. And Blackwood, former adversary turned unlikely ally, had evolved from a grieving father consumed by vengeance into a passionate advocate for conservation. The sound of vehicles arriving outside announced the donor group's arrival. Mason straightened his tie and gathered his thoughts. These presentations had become routine, yet he never took them for granted. Each person who left understanding the bears a little better represented another voice for protection, another chance for Shadow and her kind to thrive in their natural home. Victor Blackwood entered first, ushering in a group of well-dressed visitors. He had changed physically in the past months. The perpetual tension in his face had eased, and he had let his hair grow slightly longer, softening his once severe appearance. More significant was the change in his demeanor, the sharp-edged corporate ruthlessness replaced by a quieter, more reflective presence. "Dr. Reynolds," Blackwood greeted Mason with a firm handshake. "Allow me to introduce Elaine Harrington of the Harrington Wildlife Foundation and her associates." As Mason welcomed the visitors and began his presentation, he noted Blackwood taking a seat in the back row. Their relationship remained complex, not quite friendship, but a respectful collaboration built on shared purpose and mutual understanding of loss. They still disagreed on certain aspects of the conservation program, but the heated animosity had been replaced by productive debate. The presentation went well, with engaged questions from the Harrington Group and promises of follow-up discussions about funding. Afterward, as the visitors toured the interactive exhibits with Margaret, Blackwood approached Mason with a small package in hand. "This came for you," he said, handing over a padded envelope. "It was delivered to my office in town by mistake." Mason thanked him, tucking the package into his jacket pocket for later. They walked together toward the observation deck where Eleanor was setting up a spotting scope for the visitors. "The winter tracking data is promising," Mason commented. "All 3 collared females have established dens within the protected area." Blackwood nodded. "I've been reviewing the economic impact reports as well. River Point businesses are reporting a 30% increase in revenue since the center opened. The ecotourism model is working." "Your son would be proud," Mason said quietly. "Of all of this." Blackwood was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the forest below. "I've been thinking about what to do with his photographs, the ones from that day, but also all the others he took. He had quite an eye for wildlife photography, even at 8. They would make a powerful exhibit," Mason suggested. "A child's perspective on the animals he loved." "Perhaps." Blackwood seemed to consider the idea. "It might be time to share Michael with the world, rather than keeping his memory locked away in my grief." As the donors departed with promises of support, Mason found a quiet moment to open the package Blackwood had delivered. Inside was a small wooden box carved with intricate bear paw prints. A note accompanied it. Found on the hiking trail near the East Ridge. Thought you should have it. Sheriff Harrison. Mason opened the box carefully. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried moss, lay another bear-track stone. This one smaller than the others, with the perfect impression of a bear cub's paw. Beneath it was a faded photograph Mason didn't recognize at first. When he turned it over, his breath caught. It showed Sarah kneeling beside a small black bear cub with a distinctive crescent mark on its ear. But unlike the photograph he kept on his desk, this one included another figure, a younger Mason standing nearby, watching Sarah work with obvious admiration. On the back, in Sarah's handwriting, Shadow's release day, new beginnings. Mason stared at the photograph, then at the bear-track stone, the timing, the location where it had been found. It wasn't possible, and yet— "What's that?" Eleanor asked, approaching from the visitor center. Mason showed her the stone and photograph, watching her expression shift from curiosity to wonder. "Where did this photo come from?" she asked. "I don't remember you having it." "I didn't," Mason said quietly. "It was with the stone. Harrison found them on the East Ridge Trail." Eleanor studied the items, her scientific mind clearly struggling with the implications. "You don't think—" "I don't know what to think," Mason admitted, "but it feels like—" "A message," Eleanor finished softly. "From Sarah? From the universe? From Shadow herself?" Mason carefully returned the items to the box. "Maybe it doesn't matter who it's from. Maybe what matters is the message itself." "Which is?" "That everything is connected," Mason said, his gaze drawn to the forest where Shadow and her cubs had disappeared hours earlier. "That loss isn't the end of the story. That healing is possible, even after the deepest wounds." That evening, after the center had closed to visitors, Mason hiked alone to the north observation deck. The full moon illuminated the snow-covered landscape, transforming the familiar daytime vista into a silvery dreamscape. He stood in the quiet cold, listening to the night sounds of the forest, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of branches in the gentle breeze. From his pocket, he took the bear-track stone, running his thumb over the small paw impression. Then, following an impulse he couldn't entirely explain, he placed it on the deck railing, a silent offering to the night. "Thank you," he whispered, to Shadow, to Sarah, to whatever forces had brought healing to this mountain and to his own wounded heart. As he turned to leave, a movement at the forest edge caught his eye. Mason paused, squinting into the moonlit darkness. There, just visible among the trees, stood Shadow. She was alone this time, her cubs presumably safe in their den. For a long moment she stood watching the observation deck where Mason stood, too far away to see him clearly by human standards, but perhaps aware of his presence nonetheless. Mason remained perfectly still, honored by this rare, solitary appearance. After what seemed like minutes, Shadow turned and melted back into the forest, disappearing like a shadow herself among the trees she called home. On the walk back to his cabin, no longer a place of isolation but a comfortable base for his work at the center, Mason found himself filled with a profound sense of peace. The journey that had begun with a desperate mother bear on his porch had come full circle, healing wounds he had thought would pain him forever. Sarah was gone, but her passion lived on in the work he did each day. Shadow and her cubs were wild and free, protected in their natural habitat, and Mason himself had found his way back, to purpose, to community, to a life fully lived. As he reached his cabin, Mason paused to look up at the star-filled winter sky. Somewhere in these mountains, Shadow was returning to her cubs, guided by instinct and intelligence through the moonlit forest. And here stood Mason, no longer hiding from life but embracing it in all its painful beauty. Two souls, human and bear, bound by circumstance and choice, each finding their way forward after devastating loss. Different paths, different forms, but perhaps not so different in the ways that truly mattered. in the capacity to endure, to protect, to hope, and ultimately, to heal. Mason opened his cabin door, stepping into warmth and light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new visitors to educate, new data to analyze. The work of conservation was never truly finished, but tonight, in the quiet of his mountain home, Mason Reynolds slept peacefully, no longer haunted by what he had lost, but grateful for what remained and for what had been found. In the forest below, shadow curled protectively around her sleeping cubs in their winter den, her massive body providing warmth and security in the cold night. The young bears dreamed their bear dreams, unaware of how close they had come to death, or of the unlikely alliance that had saved them. And on the observation deck, the small bear track stone remained where Mason had placed it, a token of connection between worlds that most would consider forever separate, a silent testament to the extraordinary journey of a dying bear cub and the man who defied all expectations to save it. In life's winter seasons, Mason Reynolds discovered that healing comes in the most unexpected forms, even through a desperate mother bear and her dying cub. After losing his wife Sarah, Mason retreated from the world until the day nature itself knocked on his door asking for help. This remarkable true story reminds us that it's never too late to find purpose again after loss. Like Mason, many of us have faced heartbreaking chapters, the empty spaces left by loved ones, careers ended too soon, or dreams we had to surrender. But his journey shows us that second acts aren't just possible, they're waiting for us. Through connecting with Eleanor, Margaret, and even his former adversary Blackwood, Mason rebuilt not just a life, but a legacy that honored what was lost. What unexpected messenger has appeared in your life when you needed guidance most? Has a chance encounter or unexpected event ever redirected your path in meaningful ways? We'd love to hear your stories of healing and rediscovery in the comments below. Remember, sometimes the most profound connections come when we're brave enough to open our doors to the wilderness of new possibilities.